Hello, welcome to the show. You're on my channel here on YouTube, and I'm here every Thursday talking about Docker, DevOps, and a lot of different topics. Let's just get straight to the show today because I'm excited to have another special guest this week, Chris Hickman. And hello, Chris. How are you doing?
Hi, great to be here, Brett.
Yeah, thanks for being here. We met at DockerCon actually this year in San Francisco and talked about all sorts of stuff, for quite some time in the hallway, which is the best part of conferences is to meet people in the community and chit chat. So let me tell you all, the audience, a little bit about Chris. He is the VP of Technology at Kelsys, and he's an entrepreneur, technical leader, and accomplished developer. He's founded two companies, one with 24 million in VC, very nice. The other bootstrapped with an SBA loan, very cool as well. For those of you not in the United States, that's a small business administration, right? That's small business loans. And now he's at Kelsys leading the teams building world-class software in the cloud using AWS, Docker, and the latest, most productive technology stacks. He's in Seattle, which is the ground zero of the cloud, back in the day with AWS. And Chris enjoys spends time with his family, cycling, and endlessly throwing a tennis ball to his black Labrador, Gus. Welcome to the show. Thanks a lot. So,
Thanks, Brian.
we were talking before the show. In fact, we were talking at DockerCon about orchestrators and containers. And so I thought we're going to talk about a lot of things today. So if you're watching the show live, definitely get your questions in chat. You'll see people like Biker in there, Biker and other people asking questions. Those are people that are around all the time. So get your Docker and DevOps questions in. We're going to be talking about AWS. We'll probably talk about some security topics. But later on in the show, if you're able to hang around, we're going to answer the questions that are in the queue. Hopefully, we'll be able to get through all of them, and you'll get your question answered. And if you have to go back to work or if it's just late in the evening for you, you can always come back to this channel later and watch it recorded later on. So if you get your question in, basically, we'll answer it. You can come back later and see the answer. No pressure, Chris, but you're going to have some questions.
Bring it on.
So other than wearing some really cool Docker swag from DockerCon, what have you been doing this year in the cloud? I know you've been working a little bit in AWS.
Yeah, so definitely all very much involved with AWS. Just about everything that we build, that is the preferred cloud provider for Kelsys and what we're doing. And one of the reasons just being there. All these cloud providers are advancing so quickly. The technology is changing so rapidly. They're just have thousands of people working on these new capabilities and services, and trying to keep up with one, let alone 3 or 4 public clouds it's kind of impossible, right? So right now, I mean, no one's going to get fired for choosing AWS, right? It's not going anywhere.
It's the IBM
soon.
of the cloud, right? Nobody
gets fired. As of today, yeah, for sure, right? So that's kind of our go-to preferred cloud provider, and I've been using AWS in production, I think, since 2012. So it's been interesting just to see it evolve over the years, and especially with containers taking off. So I've been running containers in the cloud since 2016, and just kind of amazing there too, seeing like the ecosystem grow up with it, the maturity. It was so much harder to run Docker containers in prod back in 2016 than it is now, right? So lots of really great, amazing technology, and just a lot easier to build complicated distributed systems in the cloud now.
Yeah. Of course, that's relative, right? Because those of us that have been around since 2016, we know the hard ways. So now we look at this and we're like, this is easy. But if you're new, it's like, this is not easy.
Tell me, I mean, so, you kind of mentioned the intro. It's like, okay, a past experience of creating 2 companies, one with VC money and one with the SBA loan. So, that SBA loan company, that was back in 2001, 2003, in that time frame, and there was no cloud, right? And so I had to go and get a loan from Dell for leasing $20,000 in servers, right? I had to go sign a lease with a co-location facility.
Yeah.
I had to load up all those servers into my car. I had to go down to this co-location facility in downtown Seattle. I had to rack them myself, cable them up. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it was $30,000 before I could even have Hello World.
Right. To need a website, you had to spend possibly months, right? Because you got to wait for the hardware to be
Absolutely,
manufactured, put
months.
together.
Yes. Yeah.
Did you get I remember you back in the day, you had to choose between a half rack and a quarter rack, or a
Yes.
shared rack, or a full rack, and the prices. It was like basically it was like renting an apartment.
Yeah.
You had to
Yeah,
commit to certain years, and
and that's what you were doing, right? It was basically they were giving you a secure facility that was providing power and network and cooling, and you were just leasing space, and they were literally charging you by the volume that you were taking up. So I took down a half rack, and was very cognizant of that, right? Because half rack is half the cost of a full rack.
Yeah.
So you get 1U machines, try to get things as efficiently in there as you can. And run it with it, and that was still like $720 a month just for the lease, just
to
for
have
that space, right? It's like, what could you do with $720 a month right now, like on an AWS bill? I mean,
you could run a little empire. You could run
Yeah.
you could run a social media startup. You could have a dozen apps in the app store all running with that back end. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's pretty
Yeah.
crazy. I had experience with managing some racks in an old AOL data center that once they started shrinking, basically entire Northern Virginia facilities were turned into these co-location spaces. So yeah, it was the double man trap and getting lost in the hallways because every floor looked the same, and they had to have arrows in the wall so you knew where you were in the building.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just massive. They're massive places.
Yeah.
So that's luckily no longer the case. But I'm not sure that we've basically replaced that labor with new stuff, right? Like it's now we got to learn about orchestration and high availability, and everybody expects 100% uptime and all that stuff. So what are some of the stuff that you're working on specifically in AWS?
Yeah, so so containers and just about every piece of software we deploy is containerized. We have a little bit of serverless that we're using where it makes sense, but for the most part, everything is containerized. It's run on ECS, so which is Amazon's version of orchestration for Docker containers. So everyone very familiar probably with Kubernetes and Swarm as two of the primary orchestration systems, but Amazon has their own called ECS, and we use that. It's very mature, robust. Because we're all in at Amazon, using the Amazon version of an orchestrator makes a lot of sense because it's really tight integration with the rest of Amazon services.
Yeah, so did you do that actual evaluation where you were looking at different orchestrators and you just knew what you wanted, or was it more like we're just going to use whatever AWS has, which both are valid reasons, right? But
right, yeah. I mean, so again, I've been running containers in Amazon since 2016. At that point, Kubernetes was not there really, right?
Pre
so
1.0, yeah.
Yeah, so there really wasn't any other option other than ECS. Or actually, at that point, ECS was rather new. Most people were running Docker containers manually, right? Like installing Docker on a VM in the cloud and then managing start-stop of containers. I mean, just really crazy stuff. So ECS was really the only option at that point. And then, as you just continue working with it, it gets just the built-up knowledge. So when Kubernetes comes out, it's like there's not really a compelling reason to switch,
right?
At that point. So definitely aware of Swarm and Kubernetes, looking at like what capabilities they have. But with us not really being in a hybrid environment, there's not a big compelling reason to go with something like Kubernetes.
Right. Certainly not from a business perspective, right? If you're looking at business value, it's hard to justify switching from one orchestrator to another, no matter which one you use. I think it's just like any layer of the stack, right, that we implement. Unless it's truly plug and play, which it's very rare to see anything like that, where you can really just easily swap one out for the other. You've got to retrain people. You've got, there's a lot of, you got to test. Obviously, there's a trust factor there where you've got to use it over time before you really start to trust it. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we all end up with what we consider at some point legacy, is it because it always worked.
Yeah.
And then at some point we hear from someone else that that's no longer the cool new thing, but it still works. And if we were constantly replacing everything with new things, we wouldn't be able to get any work done. So, and I don't even think the ECS is old. Like, it's not. It just was. It was kind of there first. I think there was Swarm Classic, right? We had Swarm Classic, and then we had ECS, which runs on top of Docker as well. So yeah, it's still. I think it's a very, very legitimate use case.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's, I don't know, but I've definitely managed quite a few teams over the years, and developers for certain are like the shiny thing is always really interesting, right? But I think it, like you point out, it's really important to take a pragmatic approach to it. There's so much stuff that we could chase.
Yeah.
You really have to ask yourself and do that introspection. Say, like, is this really something I really want to spend the cycles on, the resources on? Because you have only so much bandwidth, right, or resources on your team that you can do. So you have to really choose wisely. Think about all the massive shifts we've even had in the last like 4 or 5 years with kind of like cloud native becoming a real thing. So you have DevOps is kind of a whole new methodology, and it requires a lot of culture process change, and different ways of people thinking with now having like a CI/CD pipeline and what that entails. And you have containerization represented a very big mind shift in developers and operators and whatnot. So there's lots of new things to go chase after. The bleeding edge is always there, but you can't chase everything on the bleeding edge. You'll never get anything done, and you're going to get cut, and you're going to get cut, right?
Yeah, especially if you have a boss, right? Like most of us do. And when you try to sell them on the new idea, the new thing, and then you do something with it, and then it doesn't work right, or it fails, or it takes too long, or whatever, it kind of tends to be on you, and it starts to affect your reputation. So a lot of us, I think, especially when we're passionate about technology, we like something new, and we want to use it in our company. And a lot of times you have to sort of put yourself on the line to be able to implement that and prove that it's worth something. And that can sometimes be a scary thing, especially if you're a junior developer, you're just getting started in DevOps and you're not used to that level of risk involved. I think sometimes some of us get used to it. And when there's failures, we're just like, yeah, you roll with the punches. Hopefully I don't get fired. So I'm just curious, if you had someone knowing a little bit about Swarm and Kubernetes, if someone was on the fence, right? Because there's a lot of students in my courses, and one of the most common questions when we start talking about orchestration is which one to use. That's true of all layers of the stack. I think a long time ago we were talking about, do I use Puppet or Chef, right? Or Ansible, Puppet, Chef. Like people were, at every different layer of abstraction. I think we've all had discussions around which tool to use. Are there any things that stick out for you that you really like about ECS? I mean, you've mentioned that it's just there. It's built in AWS, so it's streamlined with CloudFormation, and I'm sure all the other tools that you would want to use. But can you think of anything else?
So it's maturity, right? So it's definitely I said it's been since I think maybe near the end of 2015 is when it came out, right? So it's a mature technology. They have lots of resources behind it. It's actively in development. It has that tight integration with the other AWS services, which is a huge benefit, right? If you're in AWS, having that tight integration with things like load balancers, with Route 53 DNS, being able to do things like service discovery, almost like you can just check a box now, and now you can do service discovery through Route 53, right? Which is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So there's and then also it's a much quicker onboarding process, I think, with ECS. So ECS is pretty quick you can be just brand new to it. You can spin up an ECS cluster and start running containers on it literally within an hour. And I don't think you can say that about Kubernetes,
Right.
like just starting from scratch, right?
Yeah,
Like,
unless you're using a hosted one, right? Yeah,
yeah.
and even then, you got to know your YAML. Where
Hmm.
I mean, there's something to be said. I mean, about sort of like the single vendor solutions. And I know that AWS. I mean, that's one of their big strengths, right? You go to their conferences, it's a completely overwhelming experience because there is
Hmm.
so much stuff. It reminds me of I used to go to all the Microsoft Tech Ed conferences, and now they're no longer called that, but there would be 15,000 developers and IT pro sysadmins there, and it was almost exclusively Microsoft tools, right? So it was like you were using this pure stack, one vendor, one phone call away, and it didn't mean that every single piece of the pie was the best tool, but that tight integration allowed really, in our case, because I was working at a city government, it allowed a very small team to run 700 servers and 7,000
Hmm.
desktops.
Yep.
There was less than 20 of us, so I can imagine that's this very similar experience to AWS, where when you have all those tight integrations of that time savings, you don't have to implement some other DNS solution for service discovery. You can probably use the same AWS CLI to do all these things. I can imagine that it's very alluring to, or, it's going to be a lot of gravity there to prevent you from wanting to leave to another tool for sure.
Yeah. And again, I think it just comes down to just pragmatism and like just the right tool for the right job. And you just have to ask yourself, like, I want to build a reliable, robust, distributed piece of software, right? I want it to be up. I need to be able to observe it and monitor it. What's the quickest way there? And I want to make sure I don't want to reinvent the wheel either, right? So like this is actually in Amazon. They love talking about undifferentiated heavy lifting, right? Like years past, that would be my mantra was like, what's your core competency, and everything else you outsource, right? Like again, we have only so much bandwidth, and there's only so much that we can go chase, right? So whatever it is that differentiates you, like that's what you devote your resources to. If it's undifferentiating, then you really shouldn't be spending time on that. And it's the same thing with I think, which is picking things like in the cloud with AWS, right? Like if it's something where like it's it's just apples to apples, like say Kubernetes versus ECS, like is there really, like, can I give a really strong, compelling business reason what gains am I going to get from switching to it versus like it's going to take weeks and weeks and weeks of effort to do that switch, right? There's not a lot of bang for the buck, versus there are services that AWS offers that we don't use, right? We use other third-party software for it just because it's so much better, and there is that business reason. So like log collection and analysis is one of those, right? CloudWatch logs are not the best.
Right.
They're getting better, but it's still like there's so much better tools out there for that. So we use third parties for that.
Yeah. I haven't used it recently. The last time I used it was CloudWatch logging was right when they finally made search possible. and and we were already on Datadog and other solutions at the time. And it's interesting to hear you say that, because I wasn't really up on the latest. Is CloudWatch truly a competitor when you start looking at some of these other advanced tools? Of course, you got to pay for those other tools. CloudWatch kind of just comes out of the box.
Yeah. I mean, CloudWatch. I think they're starting to put a little bit more attention to that now. They've come out with CloudWatch Insights, which is a way of applying a semi-structured schema to the logs, and so you can start doing these queries that you would expect from other services like Sumo Logic or Loggly or Datadog or whatnot. But still, those other services, I mean, that's all they do, right? They're hyper focused in that particular thing, whether it be APM or logging or analytics or whatnot. So again, it's just what's the right choice for you? Like, it's just in that particular case, it's just not sufficient for what we want to do. Logs are super important for us, right? For our software. So
yeah, and I'm a big fan of outsourcing all that. In fact, it's something that I do demos. I think I've done it at DockerCon before, where I show like a completely open source stack, and then after I show all the super fancy monitoring and logging open source tools, that's probably at some point like a public statement of you probably don't want to do that. Like outsource that. Even if you're someone who if you like ELK and you want that, get Log Z or somebody that actually runs it for you, because
Yeah.
I don't know anybody that has a bunch of free time in their day as a developer or a DevOps person. So like, you need time back. So outsource these things that I consider plumbing.
Yeah.
Right now the infrastructure is plumbing. Right, you don't have to walk into the rack anymore and freeze yourself being on the cold side. You have to make that choice, right? Back in the rack
Yeah.
days, where am I going to be on the hot side of this rack or on the cold? Am I going to burn up or am I going to freeze to death? And I'd always choose to be cold and take a jacket, because
Yeah.
yeah, and so you don't have to choose that anymore. So why not outsource some of that stuff that's so much plumbing? I mean, I'm sure those companies would argue that it's not plumbing and that they have lots of differentiating features, but at the end of the day, you do need logging and monitoring, but maybe just let someone else care about it. So.
Yeah. 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 I mean, like, don't pretend like you can do it better than someone like that, right? Like, so it's like
Same thing with databases.
And again, yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those questions, like, if you have a product or a service that you're delivering, right, ask yourself, like, are customers going to choose you because you have a better logging, because you implemented logging yourself, right? Like, again, that's not a core differentiator. Instead, focus on your product, what it is that is really your core competency, and focus on that.
Yeah. Do you have any other non-AWS tools that you would recommend?
Yeah, so I mean, as far as like CI/CD pipeline goes, I mean, AWS has, they have their whole CodeStar suite of tools, and honestly, I think it's kind of still scratching my head on like why they're doing that, because there's just so much better tools out there. So we use Circle CI. Circle CI is wonderful. Does it anything and everything that we need it to do, and
that's hosted, right?
It is. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you can get it, I think, self-hosted if you want. They do have that capability, but yeah, we just as a service, and there's some issues there with like what happens when you want to actually do like integration, automate integration test, where you need to actually call into services that are inside inside Amazon. So there's some, but that's really about the only limitation there.
Yeah.
Everything else, I mean, just doing the good hygiene stuff, right? Whether it be like linting, running, automated tests that don't require integration environments, image scanning, other security scanning type things, code coverage, metrics, static code analysis, verifying builds, pushing builds, publishing builds. I mean, all that stuff. Just totally do. Make it, automate it, make it part of your pipeline. So Circle CI works great for us.
It's the workhorse of our pipelines, right?
It is. I mean, think about how much time it saves, and like it's not only that, it just prevents so many mistakes. It's a really good, like, making sure all the boxes are checked, and eliminating the human element of like just the fatigue of like, hey, did this happen? Did you run this test? Did you check for this or that?
Yeah, and to think 10 or 15 years ago, we were paying teams of people to do all that manually, and then you would schedule a release every 6 months, every year, and then they would spend 6 weeks, 8 weeks doing all of the stuff that basically is done for you in a matter of minutes, automated on a daily basis. It's an amazing transformation. It's caused a lot of people to have to rethink their job strategy. But that's the way of tech, right? You've got to keep working yourself up the stack and keep flexible. I think that's a common trend. Being an educator in the industry is you see a lot of people coming in and they're transitioning out of maybe they're in a purely operations traditional role, and they're trying to get more closer to developers with a DevOps role. You see a lot of change, and sometimes I hear people they're frustrated, and I try to without sounding like a jerk, because obviously in a bind, and I'm always like, well, if you hit yourself to one thing and you do that only one thing for years, that is a little scary, because if that one thing is no longer important, I mean, think about mainframes. I worked at several companies that had mainframes, and eventually they had 5, then they had 4, then they had 3 developers, they had 2, and then eventually they had one one guy that was retired and would consult to us whenever we needed him. We still had the mainframe,
Mhm. Yeah.
but it was running Linux at that point. It was running Linux VMs, late
Wow.
2000s, and he came in to do a couple of things every month. He was living the good life in retirement, and then and the plan was once he retired, we didn't need anybody. Like we were going to just get rid of it or something. So
Right.
um, I think that's true of every. I mean, I've not seen someone that's doing the same job they were doing 20 years ago,
Yeah.
or even 10 years ago. So it's really rare, and I think that advice for y'all just getting into this world: learning is a part of your lifestyle. Like take a half a day a week and just read something, learn something, try something new. Even if your job doesn't require it, just maybe ask nicely over time to get your boss to, the nice thing is if a boss lets you have like 4 hours a week for self-improvement, learning stuff, because it's going to help the company if they don't see that. And you definitely need that I think in every role of IT. Even if you're just in operations and you're sort of still in the data center, just clicking the things, making sure they work and all that stuff. I still think that role is changing, and that you definitely want to start learning. So hey, I got some courses. So same as self promotion.
Yeah.
You can learn some things
Yeah.
for $10. Click the link over there.
And I mean, just to underscore, I mean, that is such an important point. And I mean, I'm a huge proponent of that as well. Like, I would say, like, if you're in the tech industry, it's not just a part of your job. I would actually say this is your biggest asset, is the ability to learn, right? The growth hacking, the growth mentality, because the rate of change is accelerating. It's not even constant anymore, right? It's 5 years from now, the environment is going to look dramatically different. And so, I mean, we may not be talking about Kubernetes. We may not be talking about containers. And we're going to be talking a lot more about AI and ML, I guarantee you. We're going to be talking a lot more about automation. We're going to be dealing a lot more with statistics and data. So you have to have that growth mentality, because it's going to change. And if you specialize, like, you have to be really, really careful about that. And make sure, like, what you're picking, like, make sure you understand, like, the pros and cons of that. And even if you do specialize, just make sure you still have that growth mentality. Be learning. Like, you can go deep in something, but just make sure that you're still learning and understanding, like, what's going on in the landscape, because it will pass you by. I mean, it's kind of like doggy paddle, right? I mean, it's kind of a furious doggy paddle in the deep end of the pool. And if you stop paddling, it's over.
Yeah, eventually you're not gonna be paddling anymore. The something we've talked about on this show several times before is a great analogy I heard from a guy named Mark Manassi, who's a tech trainer, tech educator, news guy. 15 years ago, I think I heard this, was at one of his. He ran a little conference here in Virginia Beach, and it was just a couple hundred people. It was really fun. And someone talked about that when you look at if we have a pure generalist over here, and we have a pure specialist on the other end, and there's a wide spectrum in the middle, right? Mm-hmm. And on both ends of that spectrum, you're at risk. In other words, a generalist typically doesn't get paid well, just because that's almost like tier 1 tech support kind of generalist. They just know a little bit about a lot of things, but can't really go deep. And a specialist, like you're saying, is now, decades later, we now realize that is actually risky when you're really specialized on just one thing. Mm-hmm. And so he talked about the middle being the optimum path for the future, which he called a virtualist, which was basically, and it had a nice little graph to show off that you're a specialist in an ever increasing amount of areas. So you go deep in a topic for a while, and then you hop to the next topic and you go deep in that. So you become not quite as deep as a specialist, but you're not near as weak as a generalist. And that strength and the pace of technology and everything, that was going to keep you both well paid and employable. And I've found that insight has helped my entire career, sort of stay on track when I feel like I'm either getting too general or too specific. Got to get back in that middle.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a term we've used is a T-shaped. Having a skill set that's T-shaped, right? So the generalist part is the upper part of the T, but then go deep, and that's the bottom part of the T. Go deep on something, but make sure you still have that good general landscape and flexibility and change where that you're going deep over time as well.
Yeah, I like that one. I like that one too. That's another good analogy. Well, we have some questions in the chat, and I don't want to. I want everybody to know that we are going to get to your questions. So there's a couple of things we haven't mentioned. By the way, you have your own podcast that I found months ago called MobyCast, right?
Right. Yeah. So we myself and my colleague John Christensen. We were actually thinking about like, okay, how do we kind of share some of this knowledge that we have about just Docker and containers. It's one of those things. We had just gone through this process of, I had introduced our team to this, and I came to Kelsus in the beginning of 2017, so I've been here about 2.5 years. And when I first came to Kelsus, we weren't using containers and Docker, right? So that was one of the first times, like, okay, this is what we got to change, right? We're gonna go to, yeah. So we're gonna do this, right? So, and I've done this now with a few different teams, and that process of going from like not using containers to using containers, it's not an easy process for people, right? Because it does represent like it's a culture shift, it's a mind shift, and so we were sitting down. Having lunch and kind of like talking about this, and we actually had a guy that Rich that helps us out with marketing, and so we were just talking, and we ended up just talking like Rich was like, well, I'm kind of confused, like what's the difference between a virtual machine and a container, right? And so we ended up having like this 30-minute talk where we kind of take a complicated idea and try to explain it to someone like Rich, who is very smart, but he's not a developer, right? He's not a technologist. He knows everything about marketing and WordPress sites and whatnot. So, and from that, it was like, you know what? Let's do a podcast like this. We think that this would be interesting. So that was a little over a year ago. I think we just got done taping episode 70. We do it once a week. Comes out on Wednesdays, and it's been a lot of fun. And so we originally called it MobyCast because we were really focused on Docker, and Moby being the mascot of Docker. And we kind of quickly, within the first 10, 15, 20 episodes, it's like, well, there's only so much we can really say about Docker now. We kind of covered that, right? So we're gonna branch out, and we're gonna talk about just basically what does it mean to build modern apps and cloud native environment, and everything that goes along with it, and sometimes talk a little bit more about we'll get into just business landscape and just like what's going on in the community between companies, and sometimes we really go deep in technical topics. But it's been a lot of fun. It's a learning process too. I don't know about you, but like after the first 10 episodes are a little rocky.
Right. It's a lot of work, right? I mean,
so much work.
You think that people just sit down and turn on a phone recorder and you can talk and then just put it on the internet, but it's a lot. It's a lot. It is.
It's a lot. And I think that I found out the more that you do it, and of course, like the more audience you get, right? Like the responsibility you feel towards it, right, grows. Yeah. Right, yeah. And the pressure for that grows. So I definitely find myself now spending a lot more time on it, preparing, trying to really make this the best that make it the best show that we can. Versus early on, it was a little bit more ad hoc.
And I think if anyone else is interested in stuff like this, I'm going to just guess you don't regret any of it, right? Like you had to start somewhere. Like
yeah, you do. And I mean, the thing is like just persistence and grit is like key here, right? Like how many, like there's a lot of people, I mean, anyone can go do a podcast, right? Say I'm creating a podcast and go do it, right? And it's one thing to do it, 3-4 episodes, but then that's kind of like usually what happens, right? People fall off. But if you're gonna do it, commit to it and stick with it. And it's a lot of fun. It's cool to interact with other people, to hear to see get reviews or ratings, and just know that like you're not just talking into the ether, that folks are listening to it. We've had people reach out to us, like people in the investment community that are analysts, right, that are recommending stocks for their portfolios and coming to us and asking us for advice in the tech industry, like what's going to happen, this company versus that. So it's really that kind of stuff definitely reinforces it and makes it very rewarding, and it's just fun to do too.
Yeah, it is, especially when you're doing it with friends. So yeah, that's the fun part. I love having friends on the show, and interesting people, and that's my highlight is and getting all the feedback is always fun as well. Let's get to some questions. Let's talk now. Of course, the rule on this show is that there are no rules. But of course, we get to pick the questions, right? So if you don't ask a question that we like, then we're not gonna answer it. And Biker 2010, who's like probably number one question asker on the show, like he would get the award for the most questions asked. Met at DockerCon. He jumps in with the first question talking about Docker Compose. He says, I've been struggling with the subtle differences of Docker Compose and Docker Stack Deploy YAML. In particular, how labels are used. The very simple traffic getting started example works fine with Compose, but fails when the same file is used in a stack until you move the labels a little. Could you make a few comments about the differences? I think really what you're talking about there, Biker, is the fact that in the Compose format, labels can be at the container level or at the service level. So this is kind of similar to Kubernetes, where all these different orchestrators have layers of abstraction. And so in Swarm, it goes, there's the container, then there's a task that runs that container, then there's a service that runs that set of containers or that set of tasks. And then if you go to stacks, the stack YAML file is sort of an abstraction higher, and it's multiple services, many services and volumes and stuff like that. So one of the mistakes that people make with labels, because it looks like you could just put it in there on the service, but sometimes different applications like traffic will require them to be at a different level in that layers of abstraction. So I believe with traffic, you need to have it at the service level, not necessarily at the container level. So you have to put that in your YAML. You have to move that because Docker Compose doesn't know what a Swarm service is, so Docker Compose doesn't have that understanding. So yeah, you do have to move those basically in the YAML from the service itself down, I believe, under the deploy section. So hopefully that helps. Pretty tough question right off the bat to see if one of us knew that.
That's pretty deep. Yeah.
That's pretty deep. Well, Biker and I have had lots of conversations. So we know each other. He knows what I know, and I know what he's working on.
He's testing you.
Yeah, that's right. Challenge accepted, sir. Charlie asks, could you tell us what camera you use? I needed to look this up. The camera I'm using is a Canon mirrorless M50, and there's a website, and I think it's called kits.com. Let me find it. No, it's kit.com. No, it's singular. Yeah, so here, I'll put this in chat. It's kit.com/Brett Fisher. It's actually a list of all my hardware and most of my software that I use in different setups. It's a website designed to help creators share their kits, essentially, of tools. So go check that out. It's singular kit.com/Brett Fisher. Let's see. Oh, and you know what? My team put it in the chat already, so I didn't even need to say it. So yeah, Biker's back. Let me see. I sold my company, moving everything to Docker. We're moving from our own 300 server farm to Azure. And his butt's on the line if the web servers aren't harder, faster, better, stronger. So yeah, perfect. Exactly. I mean, part of our job in technology is not just to run these things, but also to make decisions. And sometimes we end up having to take all this risk on our shoulders. The best part about a job, all the best jobs I've had are where my boss was always going to defend me. Like, even if I made bad decisions, he was going to go to bat for me, to management, and that's always great when you know that you're given a little bit of allowance to take risks, and you can try things and not worry that you're going to suddenly be fired because something didn't go the way you appreciate it. Of course, you might have a stern talking to.
Yeah. I mean, if you don't have a supportive manager like that, then probably should spend a little bit more time on LinkedIn.
Yep. Yeah, I think after having done this over 25 years, I would say pick the boss, not the job.
Yep.
You can do lots of. If you have a really great boss, you can make work fun and enjoyable. But when you have a bad boss, everything else starts to suck. Suddenly you want
Yep.
more money. Suddenly you feel like you're working too long. Like suddenly all the other things become a problem because your life just isn't fun at work. So yeah, pick the boss.
Yep.
Let's see. John's up. Do you have any advice for moving 50 plus microservice set of applications that are not micro at all, over to Docker and containerization in any way that isn't a big bang approach, and orchestrating the resulting mixture of containerized and non-containerized elements during the transition? So, what do you think? Do you have, Chris? Do you have any? You've probably gone through some of that.
Yeah, I mean, this is lather, rinse, repeat, right? You definitely have to do it incrementally, and so it's kind of hard to understand like what you're actually starting with there. If there are truly 50 independent services, then containerizing them and moving them, into that environment should be rather straightforward. If they're more intertwined and not truly independent, then it gets a little bit trickier. But with any of these kind of migrations, it's divide and conquer, right? Like it's not going to be don't do a big bang. I mean, there's way too much risk with that. There's no rollback. It's just a lot of work, and then you flip a switch and you just really just praying that it all goes well. So divide and conquer, do it bits at a time, figure out and pick the easiest stuff first, right? Especially if this is new to you. So if you've not been running containers in production before and this is the first thing, like don't pick the most critical piece of the system, right? Pick something that is more on the edges that, if it did go bad, right? Like it's not going to be the end of the world.
Yeah, that's good stuff. I think sometimes one of the things I also recommend. I mean, I think both of us are going to say, definitely don't do it whole hog. Like, that would mean that you would have to do months and months of testing, and that would be like a waterfall approach to infrastructure. You want to think of it more on an agile DevOps approach of, I'm going to change the smallest part possible, and then I'm going to just rinse and repeat. So. Don't move your databases first. Move your databases last, or better yet, just have someone else run them. Things that are that don't require persistent data would definitely be my recommendation to go early. Is you find the things that if the container goes away, you just make a new container, like a web app, an API, something like that doesn't have persistent data store requirements, because that just adds more complexity to you getting it up. And one of the things about containers when you're doing migrations for the first time with a company, this is kind of like, I'm sure Chris was around. We went from physical infrastructure to VMs. It was a very similar experience of it. It affected everything at every layer, it seemed like. And even the developers had to be involved because you had to figure out how to get their app off that physical machine into a VM and then, and be able to move it around. And so you had to understand it more. So all that being said, basically, you're going to try to do the easiest, smallest apps first. But if you can, also do the apps that are going to be updated more often. Because one of the things I think that really helps an organization get sold on the idea of containers is to get one of these early wins to where it affects a business goal, not just a technical goal. So maybe there's a business goal where you want to be able to deploy software faster or something like that you can align this work to. So even if you're not a business-focused person, you're just really into the tech, figure out that way so that you can get, basically, you want to get those C-level people to cheer for you. And the way you can get that done with things like Docker is to find something where it's a painful process now to update that or to change that. Or maybe when it goes down, it's difficult to troubleshoot because it's a complicated old system or whatever. Or it's expensive and you're going to save money by moving it into a new small VM running containers or whatever. So find that business goal to align with, then throw that out there, and then start updating that app. Like, make the changes more often with that app. Work with the dev team if that's not you. Update that app more often, and that way people will start to get it. They'll see that, oh man, this thing is easier to update. We're not, if there's a problem, we can just replace it. They start to get that idea of what, not just what a physical container does, but the whole workflow of how containers change things. And then from then on, it's just like Chris is saying, rinse and repeat. Keep doing it over and over again. Go progressively harder to the bigger, more complicated parts of the app. But you're definitely not going to be able to do it all at once. And at the end of the day, there's nothing really different fundamentally about a distributed app in a container than pre-container. Generally, it should be easier to do in containers, but you're still going to have to deal with DNS routing of the packets from the old place to the new place and all that stuff. And sometimes containers can help with that. Sometimes they can't.
So great points there. And maybe the only other thing I would add too is just like make sure you're practicing on those initial first things, and you're putting in you're building the operational capabilities to support the movement of the stuff that's to come, right? So there are some new things, like just like your CI/CD pipeline. Like how are you have to publish, you have to you're creating artifacts in the form of images. Where are they being stored? How are you pulling those? How is it being done in an automated fashion in your pipeline? How are you handling observability and monitoring of these things, and things like logging and understanding just kind of like the simple stuff like storage space. Like this is, I don't know about you, Brett, but storage space has always been one of those things that keeps kind of popping up. Our containers are, for the most part, they're stateless because we're using obviously databases, separate services hosted that for true persistence. But there's always temporary stuff. Like in log files are one of those things, and so just really understanding like that. There are some nuances and differences with running containers in production. So use that initial time to really get it done well, right? So that way you're reducing the risk as you bring on those more complicated pieces later.
Yeah, great stuff. And I think the last thing I would suggest is realize that you could plan, learn, test for months, but you'll probably learn more in the first week of real production containers than you did in all those months of planning. Like the minute you have to troubleshoot or even investigate, the way that you get into the containers is different. The way that you put your tools on a server to test on top of a container network is different. You don't necessarily have to go full-blown Kubernetes on day one just for your first container. You can start small, start simple, try some things out, and then grow as you go. If you're on AWS, ECS might be easy enough to just do that day one, and you don't have to custom deploy every layer of the stack brand new. And that's one of the things whenever I do talks on getting into Docker, I have usually a slide dedicated about projects, and the rule is the same rule as any IT project: make the projects as small as possible. You don't want to do Docker's new, Kubernetes is new, I'm going to do Prometheus monitoring now, I'm going to do ELK logging. Like, you don't want that level of change.
Yeah.
You want to change.
See you in 6 months.
Right. And you'll barely have one container out in 6 months. Like you want to go small and easy. And set your goals small, and if you can, align them with business goals. So yeah, that's great. We could have a whole show on this. Because it's hard stuff, and it's scary if you're the big advocate and you're trying to convince the rest of your team or your organization to do something like this. It can be a little daunting and scary at times. So yeah, good luck. Come back when you've got your first success and show up in the show, and we'd love to hear your comments. All right, so I had a good question on if you should use JSON or YAML in compose files. I think that pretty much all of the container world has settled on YAML as the human format. JSON is the computer format. So we're writing YAML, and then what the systems do on the back end in terms of they might translate it into JSON because they are compatible in their translations. So like when you look at Swarm in the back end, it's technically taking your YAML and turning it into JSON and storing that in the Swarm database. But that doesn't mean you should write JSON. To be fair, I understand why you might have that question, because for a while back in like 2016, 2017, Docker was suggesting a Deb, I think it was Deb format, and it was JSON for orchestration, and then the community spoke. And we basically said no. We do not want to do YAML and JSON. Let's stick to a format. The YAML's not perfect, but we've got it. Let's at least just stick with the one thing. So yeah, do that, because then that'll work wherever you want to do it. If you want to eventually move to Kubernetes, it's YAML as well. So you'll learn about spaces versus tabs, and the things of YAML that you will have to deal with versus JSON. So yeah, nice thing. My favorite feature of YAML is that I can do comments. And it doesn't break things. So
yeah, try that in JSON.
Yeah. Good luck. Yeah. So let's see. We got a few more questions here, real quick, before we run. Let's see. Biker's giving some advice on picking 2 apps to move. That's a good one. Static sites. Anything that if you lost a container, if you accidentally typed in a Docker RM, or if you're doing an orchestrator and it decides to remove and replace the container, that you won't, it won't hurt you. Let's see, John, thanks for the great advice. We're moving over containers and are new to it, myself and a lot of other taking your courses. Hey, great. Thanks for taking the courses. Thanks for being a student. And let's see, let's pick the lax. Alexandria is coming in late, a frequent viewer of the show. Have guide to write Docker buildx bake file. So no, Docker, I have nothing on buildx yet. So what he's asking about is Docker buildx is a new feature coming in the yet to be released 1903 release of Docker, and it's sort of the next evolution of a container builder, and it's got crazy new features. Like the feature, we could have a month full of podcast about buildx and all the cool things that it's going to do, and it's going to happen eventually. Little teaser is we haven't announced it yet, but on this show, when Docker goes 1903, when they announce that here pretty soon, we hope, we're going to do a week's worth of live shows, and we're going to have special guests on every one of those, showing you new features, their favorite new features of 1903 release, because I think it's the biggest release of Docker since I've started talking about Docker. They have packed so many new features into the CLI, not so much into the engine. A lot of it's in the CLI, but they had to backfill. They had to add this stuff to the engine, like the new builder. You can now have build environments. You can have build farms where you can run a single build command locally, and it builds across a series of servers. So Docker itself is changing the CI/CD game just by adding these features to the Docker CLI. So I'm really interested to see how people and how the CI/CD companies change their approach and how much more they implement Docker into their toolkit, because basically I feel like at the end of the day, a lot of this is just turning into something that runs a bunch of Docker builds and Docker commands. That's what a CI/CD system is turning into at this point. So those are all great questions. Thank you so much for asking those, and stay tuned, because we will have I already know who's going to be talking about buildx, and hopefully in the next couple of weeks. So we'll see what Docker does, and you'll see some announcements with us. So on this little link at the top, you can sign up for the newsletter, and that's when I announce new stuff coming out, and we'll definitely be talking about that big show. We're going to have like a release party, which I've never really done before, but I'm going to give it a shot. So, Chris, Thanks. Thank you so much. This has been a great talk. I'm glad we met at DockerCon and had some great conversations there.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, for those of you who are just joining or missed, check out Chris's podcast himself. It's on MobyCast. You can find that where all podcasts are played, right?
Yes, absolutely.
MobyCast.fm, I believe, is the website.
MobyCastFM.fm.
Yeah. And you can also find Chris on his Twitter handle here if you want to reach out to him down below his talking head there. Chris, where else can people find you on the internet? Or people can reach out to you? Is Twitter the right way? How can they reach out and have questions?
Twitter works for sure. I'm actually a LinkedIn guy too, so find me on LinkedIn and GitHub.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, good luck with all of the AWS work, and I look forward to hearing some updates on that as you keep advancing the Docker tooling and automating all the things. And maybe we'll just have a whole show dedicated to automation someday.
Yes.
So some real some good examples, because I think that's challenging for people to figure out all the steps and the things that they want to automate and how to do it. So.
Indeed.
Yeah, so thanks a lot, everyone. We will see you next week back here on Thursday, same time, same place on the internet. And thanks for watching.
Great. Thanks, Brett.